My name is Emily Godrich. I'm chair of the center, and I am so happy to be here for this really wonderful occasion with my friend and colleague Michael David Lukas. Michael is the program coordinator here at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, where he helps to manage the J. Christopher Stevens Global Ambassadors Project, which is basically a virtual course that connects UC Berkeley students with students in the Middle East and North Africa, and so far he's run courses between us and students in just outside of Fez, in Morocco, in Iraq, in Kurdistan, and we're going to do something with Beirut in the fall. So we're very grateful to Michael for that work that he does. But when he's not creating these international classes for us all to benefit from, he's also, of course, a novelist. He received his BA in Comparative Literature from Brown University and an MFA in Creative Writing from the University of Maryland. He was a Fulbright Scholar in Turkey and a Rotary Ambassadorial Scholar in Tunisia. This book that we have here is not even his first book, it's his second book. His first book was called The Oracle of Istanbul, published in 2011. And this one, a multi-generational novel about the Jews of Cairo, was published just last month, so mazel tov on that. This is, of course, the work that we will be talking about tonight, The Last Watchman of Old Cairo. I've asked Michael to start with a reading, and after that I'll ask him a few leading questions and give you guys a chance to do the same as well. But first, let me just say what a rare pleasure it is for me to read a book like this, a historical novel about the Middle East and about Jews of the Middle East, which is my own area of specialization, that I don't want to throw against the wall for its inaccuracies and misidentifications and so on. This novel is a real gem and very unique in that it really combines a level of scholarly erudition with creative artistry. Yesterday Michael asked me to look through and see if I found anything that was off, any historical inaccuracies, and I really couldn't, and that's quite a testament for a book that covers, you know, a good 1,000 years of history. I do have some questions about whether people actually drank mint tea in the 11th century in Cairo. But we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that later.
We can never know.
In any event, I'm going to allow you, it's a complex novel for those of you who haven't read it. So I'll allow you maybe to set the stage a little bit and talk about some of the elements, and then start with a reading. We'll go from there.
Sounds good.
Good.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for having me here. It's really a pleasure to be here in this capacity. I'm here a couple days a week, and I love it just being here as a program coordinator, but it's really nice to be here as the other hat that I wear. So as Emily said, it's 3 different plot lines, one in the 11th century, one in the 19th century, and one in sort of roughly contemporary times. And I'm going to read a little section from the roughly contemporary times, if only because it's like a good 10-minute excerpt, which is what I was told to read, and also because I was going to read it. I was up in Seattle a couple weeks ago, and I was going to read this section, but didn't because my niece and nephew were in the audience, and it was a little sort of adult themed. So with that, I'll read it. I guess the background that I can give you is that Joseph, who's the main character in the contemporary section, grew up in the United States, wasn't super connected with his father, who lived in Cairo, and in the 5th grade, I believe, went and visited his father and had a really lovely time, and then, yeah, that's where it leaves off. My father and I often discussed plans for me to visit again, but for whatever reason, money, summer camp, conflicting schedules, it never worked out. As the years passed, Cairo began to recede from my imagination. Middle school gave way to high school. Video games, pubic hair, and growth spurts were replaced with cross-country practice, AP tests, and bad poetry. I started college, came out, fell in with a group of art students in my dorm, and without much thought to the future, decided to major in English. I took to wearing long knit scarves, thick sweaters, and a tan pea coat I bought at a thrift store in Somerville. Instead of holing up in the library with the rest of my friends, I did my reading in a humid cafe off Commonwealth Ave, trying not to be too obvious as I glanced up over the top of my book and noticed the barista or that guy across the room. Everything was going smoothly, then one Sunday night, towards the end of my freshman year, I got a call from Aisha, his cousin. She said my father was sick and that I might think about coming to visit. Can I talk to him, I asked, holding up a finger to let my friends know I might be a minute. He doesn't want us to tell you, she said, but you should come. It'll be good for him to see you. My mother and Bill said they would pay for my plane ticket, and the literary magazine where I was interning that summer agreed to let me start a few weeks late. So I went. 8 years later and 12 inches taller, I returned to Cairo. That gangly, oversensitive 11-year-old transformed into a reasonably self-assured college student, shaggy about the edges, smug and bristling with the possibility of it all. Meanwhile, my father was wasting away. Aunt Bossima told me what the doctors had said, but I didn't need red blood cell counts to see that he wasn't doing well. His face was slack, and his skin had the sallow appearance of soft cheese. Most days he didn't have the energy to go out, so I spent the majority of the visit sitting next to him on the couch, watching old black and white Egyptian movies, while he sipped his tea and counted the pills on his tray. You don't need to sit here all day, he said more than once. Go out, enjoy yourself. But I knew he was glad to have me there, and I knew that one day I would be glad to have sat with him. We talked about my classes and my plans for the future. I told him about Boston and my internship. We discussed Egyptian politics, and I explained the meaning of the term post-colonial. But he didn't want to talk about his health. When I asked him how he was feeling, or whether the chemotherapy was affecting his appetite, he closed his eyes, as if the very question pained him, and changed the subject. It's always the same movie, he said, one afternoon, when I was especially insistent. He looked at me, then turned back to the television, where a handsome older man in a tuxedo was speaking to a desperate young woman. Always the same movie, even when it's different. In a way, I was glad my father didn't want to talk about his cancer. I was still trying to understand what it meant, still trying to reconcile that man on the couch with the father of my imagination. And besides, I understood. When you said something, it became real. When you said something, you had to start dealing with it. He's so much happier with you here, Aisha said a few minutes later. We were at a bar on the roof of the Four Seasons, a birthday party for one of her friends from university. You can see the difference on his face. At the other end of the table, the conversation skipped from scuba diving in Sharm el-Sheikh to someone's brother who worked in marketing at Unilever. One of Aisha's friends was telling a story about his family's maid, a refugee from the Sudan who had been living on the roof of their house. I just wish... I didn't finish the sentence, but she knew where I was going. If it makes you feel any better, he doesn't talk about it with anyone. I looked down at a plate of empty pistachio shells, then out over the roof, edge of the roof. Below us, the lights of the city bled into each other like far-off conversations, interrupted only by the empty blackness of the Nile. It's always easier to pretend, Aisha said, following my gaze. For everyone. Yeah, I said, I guess you're right. There was a double meaning to her comment, but I didn't make the connection until a few days later, when we were all out to dinner at Uncle Hassan's favorite restaurant, a fancy Lebanese place in the Hendassine, with white tablecloths and crimson-vested waiters. Toward the end of the meal, my uncle started asking me, in his clunky businessman's English, what I thought of the young women at the table next to us. They seem nice, I said. Really nice, Uncle Hassan insisted. Yeah, I agreed, brushing a pile of crumbs into my hand. Really nice. I'd come out to Aisha a few months earlier, right after I told my mother and Bill, and I think Aunt Basma might have suspected something, but I didn't intend to tell my father or Uncle Hassan, at least not for the time being. I wasn't sure how they would react, and I didn't want to stress out my father. Although, of course, that's exactly what ended up happening. What? Uncle Hassan pressed, sensing my lack of enthusiasm. Egyptian girls aren't good enough for you? He's too much in his studies, Aunt Basma interjected. You should have some fun, Yusuf. You're on vacation. Aisha did her best to change the subject, but Uncle Hassan wouldn't let up. You're on vacation, my uncle said, leaning in far too close. If you want, Yusuf, I know some nice girls. I don't want any nice girls, I said, and pulled away. Well, what do you want? He dangled the question in front of me like a flashy lure, and I knew in that moment I had a choice. I could continue hiding, I could continue protecting them and myself, or I could lay it all out on the table and hope for the best. In the silence that followed, I took a sip of water, put my glass down, and looked directly at Uncle Hassan. He raised his eyebrows, waiting for a response, and I felt a chill wash through me. When it came down to it, the issue wasn't really who I slept with. If I got a girlfriend for show and went around with guys on the side, everything would be fine. That was the standard operating procedure in Egypt, at least as far as I understood it. The transgression was in the act of confession. Boys, I said, in the calmest voice I could manage. I want some nice boys. At that point, my father, who had been watching the entire interaction in silence, rose slowly from his seat and laid his hands flat on the table. He gave his brother a look of disgust, then turned and, swaying slightly from a radiation treatment earlier that week, walked toward the bathroom. A few minutes later, he came back, lowered himself into his chair, and dabbed at his lips with a napkin. He didn't say anything, and neither did anyone else. We ate dessert, then drove back to the apartment. My father and Uncle Hassan, silent in the front seat, while Aunt Basma went on about her great aunt, who had married a Lebanese man and lived in Beirut for more than 40 years before she was killed by a car bomb intended for a PLO leader who bought croissants every morning at the bakery down the street from her apartment. My dad can be such a fucking asshole, Aisha said, once everyone else had gone to bed. She kicked the foot of her desk. You sure you're okay? Yeah, I said, staring at my hand. I think so. There was a tingling in the tips of my fingers, and my breath felt shallower than usual. Other than that, I was okay. I hadn't been disowned. No one had thrown any plates or made any angry proclamations. There wasn't even any overt disapproval. But that next morning, when I sat down next to my father, the couch cushion felt like a brick, between us felt like a brick wall. We spent the following week in tense silence. I went out a few times with Aisha and her friends, bought some touristy knickknacks. Then I flew back to Boston and started my internship. A couple weeks later, Aunt Basma called to give me an update on my father's health. He sends his love, she said at the end of the call. Is he there, I asked. Can I talk to him? He's asleep, she said, a little too quickly. But he said he wanted me to send his love. It was like that all summer. Every time I talked to Aisha or Aunt Basma, at the end of the call I would ask to talk to my father, and every time he was either sleeping or too tired or not feeling up to it. He sent his love, he asked after me, but he could never talk. Aisha said he just needed some time, and eventually I was able to convince myself that everything would work out. One day he would call and everything would go back to normal. But of course Aisha was wrong. You can never go back to normal. At the end of August, when he finally had the strength to talk, our conversation was limp and stilted. We were like two old college roommates whose lives had taken them in different directions. We talked about the weather and the news, and Uncle Hassan's business, and Basima's cooking. He asked about my internship, and I told him that one of the stories I'd picked out of the slush pile might get published in the magazine. "What's it about?" he asked. I tried to describe it, but ended up getting lost in the different narrative strands. "It sounds interesting," he said. It was then, in his polite interest, in the strain at the end of his breath, that I understood. This might be the best I could expect. Not that it was so bad. During sophomore year, my father's cancer went into remission and we settled into a new routine. There was a warmth to those conversations, if not much depth. I told him about the Arabic classes I was taking, my thoughts on applying to graduate school, and when I got in, the pros and cons of the various programs. We talked about family, politics, literature, and soccer, but we avoided digging too deep. In 7 years, we never once discussed my personal life. I never mentioned any of my boyfriends or breakups. I didn't really even talk about my friends. And I never once asked him how his treatment was going, how he was feeling. I never asked what he was thinking that evening at the Lebanese restaurant. I never asked him about leaving the synagogue or meeting my mother. I never asked about Ali el-Raqqa or the Ezra Scroll. And I never asked him to tell me another story. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah.
So this character, Joseph Raqqa means, of course, the Watchman. And the thread that connects the three different time periods, the 11th century, Cairo, 19th century, and the contemporary moment, is the Geniza. And these watchmen watch, it's a family of Muslims who watch over the Ibn Ezra synagogue in Cairo, which contains the Geniza. So why don't you start by just explaining what a Geniza is?
I was going to say, you just did.
Well, not the Geniza itself.
So there's a prohibition, and correct me if I'm wrong, if I get anything wrong, anyone. There's a prohibition against throwing away documents that have the name of God on it. And because God has so many names, and because people, or some people, wanted to be especially careful, folks would throw away basically every document. Sometimes some people would just throw away religious documents, but a lot of people would throw away more sort of mundane documents, like a shopping list or letters or a marriage contract, things like that. Many communities bury these genizot in a special section of the graveyard, but for a few different reasons, this particular community put the documents in the attic of the Ibn Ezra synagogue and continued to do that for centuries. Basically from the 11th century when the synagogue was refurbished up until maybe the 18th or 19th century. And because Cairo is so arid, the documents all just stayed up there in pretty good condition. And so when they were found, discovered, and most of them were brought back to Cambridge, which was a plot line in the novel, they comprised this amazing treasure trove, is the word that's always used, both in terms of scholarship on sort of religious themes, but also in terms of just everyday life, what it was like to be in this particular part of Cairo, and particularly to be a Jew in this particular part of Cairo. But my understanding is that a lot of what we know about the medieval Mediterranean world comes from this cache of documents. And yeah, there's this, I don't know, 7-volume book, this sort of like cornerstone of Geniza studies that basically outlines all these sort of very small details about daily life in this community in particular, and all of the communities that they had interactions with. And which is sort of like a novelist's dream and curse.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that if I want to know what sort of clothes people would wear at a 12th century Jewish wedding in Cairo, like I could find that out. But but then I kind of have to find it out because it's there, because random Amazon reviewers can also find it out. Yeah, be the bane of my existence.
So sticking with that middle section, the 19th century section, the quote-unquote discovery of the Geniza documents, they're discovered by a European Jew, Solomon Schechter, who's sort of a Moldovan Hasidic Indiana Jones, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And then also these twins, twin sisters. Can you talk about the twin sisters and is there a historical basis for them?
Yeah. There's a lot of people who sort of claim to have discovered the Geniza. There's another Eastern Central European Indiana Jones type who came through Cairo in, I think, the 17th or 18th century, claims to have discovered it himself. But the twins were the first people who sort of saw the, I think, archival and scholarly opportunities in the Geniza. And they were basically, there's so many adjectives. They're these Victorian, Orientalist, Bible-hunting millionaire twins who lived in Cambridge at a time when women couldn't attend classes at Cambridge University. And they were really interested in Semitic languages in particular, and used their money to basically hire Cambridge professors to tutor them in all these different Semitic languages. And then used other parts of their money to travel all over the Middle East and basically buy up old documents. They were driven, by scholarly reasons, but also by religious reasons. I think they thought they were going to find the sort of true, text of the Bible, or that their textual research would help sort of shed light on their religion. And so they go to Cairo many times, and on their second to last trip to Cairo, they came upon these kind of strange documents and brought them back to Cambridge and showed them to Solomon Schechter. And he realized pretty soon that these documents were very important. They actually, one particular document answered a question in his own research. And he also realized that they probably came from a Geniza because of, the dust in them, or I forget exactly why he realized that. And so all three of them went back to Cairo later that year, and what happens next is what sort of comprises the middle plot line of the novel. Basically, they convinced the Jewish community and the Egyptian authorities to allow them to take the documents back to Cambridge. And there's actually a book that is coming out soon, I think, about the twins and about this episode. And I had the good fortune of connecting with the woman who wrote it, and she fact-checked that section, which was really helpful. Because the twins are amazing. They're so colorful. They're really complicated. They're these kind of proto-feminist figures, but they're also, super imperialist. And yeah, I just found them really interesting and wanted to sort of inhabit their lives for a little while.
No, what's so wonderful about the characters in the book are that they're unexpected in so many ways. So on the one hand, you have the Makhluk family who are Muslims, then you have the twins who are Christians, and then you have Schechter and others who are the Jews. But no one, is sort of the normative version in any of those categories.
Yeah.
So yes, you have Christians, but here these are women who are denied a place in the university, and the Schechter can't be a professor because he's Jewish, and so on. And the Rambam family, they're marginal even in the Muslim community because they're poor.
Yeah.
So the characters are so interesting, but you seem to sort of, you find really interesting ways to mix them together. And one of the things you do that I think is very brave in some ways, you put them together in romantic relationships. There's a whole genre of films and novels and things like that coming out of the Muslim world these days that are in remembrance of Jews and Jewish-Muslim relations. And they always go up to a certain point. I'm thinking of Summer in La Boulette, the Sarah Levitcher does a lot of these. I'm thinking of the Moroccan film Maroc, I'm thinking of the Goodbye Mothers, or in Egypt, Salat al-Baladi. And it's always okay. The intercommunal relationship is always a good thing. It's convivencia. You can share all kinds of things, but you never cross the line into a sexual relationship. Not because in and of itself it's forbidden, but because in these cultures, in Muslim and Jewish culture in the Middle East, that means marriage and that means having children. And so what happens, you actually take that step and go, well, what happens? And you have this child. You have Joseph Yusuf, who has a Muslim father and a Jewish mother and is claimed by both communities. So can you talk a little bit how you plotted that, how you thought that out? Because it echoes in the three different
yeah, no, I thought about that exact, question and was sort of nervous about it. I knew from the get-go that Joseph was going to be of mixed parentage. In part because I've always been kind of fascinated by this idea that you could be fully Muslim and Jewish at the same time, because Judaism is matrilineally descended and Islam is patrilineally descended. So I was interested in that. And for a minute I thought of going the opposite and having him being sort of like neither or none, but I like the idea more of having sort of all of both. In terms, the 11th century was a bit harder, and in some ways Joseph's, it's allowed to happen because it happens after the expulsion of the Jews. I think it would be much more difficult to have written it in the 40s or the early 20th century when there were sort of intact Jewish communities in Egypt. But the romance happens all after the expulsion, after his mom leaves, and it's sort of romance through letters. In part because his father, who's the last Watchman, is so distraught over, what he sees as his role in the expulsion of the Jews and, the sort of end of this community. With the 11th century, it was a lot harder because I knew I wanted to do it. I knew I wanted it to be sort of this Romeo and Juliet-esque story, but I also knew that you couldn't end. It's not.
So maybe for people who haven't read the book, the first Watchman, Ali al-Raqab, falls in love with the daughter of one of the major Jewish figures.
Yeah. So it got me thinking, what's a happy ending of this story? I wanted it to be a happy ending, but I wasn't really sure what the happy ending of this story was. Them getting married seemed like a kind of impossibility, and if they did get married, they would have to, go somewhere else or assume different identities or something like that. And so that didn't feel very happy. And so, yeah, I really struggled with what would be happy in this context. And I won't give it away, but I think that I came with something. I feel like it was pretty happy.
So, Cairo, or Fustat, is really a character in the book as well. Reminds me a little bit of Andre Aciman's writing about Alexandria, but there's a sense of how the city changes over time, but a real sense of place. So I know you've spent time in Cairo. How connected was that time to your writing of this book? Did you do research? And there are a lot of place names. So at one point, Joseph was looking throughout the city for a particular street, and you really get a sense, a mental map of the city. So how did you come up with this idea of Cairo, and how connected is it to your own time you've spent there?
Well, I was in Cairo for a semester in 2000, which is when the contemporary plot takes place. And I wanted to have it be during that time because I felt like the city has changed so much in the past 18 years, and I'm sure it will change in the next 18 years, and the 18 years before that. So I wanted to have it in a time where it was the Cairo I sort of knew. Yeah, and that was really important to me. And then came back many times over the 18 years since, mostly for pleasure, but then when I came to the end of, a late draft of the book, I realized that I had to go back to the city I hadn't been there for 5 or 10 years and felt like I needed to reacquaint myself with it and to make sure that I got the sort of physical, emotional details of the city right. Like, just that air conditioners are dripping on you all the time when you're walking down the street, and like the traffic sounds and all those very small details that are important to a fiction writer. And so I went back, but the city had totally changed by that point. I mean, it was after the revolution, Mohammed Morsi was in power. It was a completely different sort of vibe in the city, for lack of a better word. And so it was really interesting being there, but obviously at the same time it was still the same city. But this other layer had sort of been added to the city, and so I had to dig a little bit to get to the Cairo of the year 2000.
Yeah, Cairo has changed a lot in, let's say, the last 100 years. It used to be a city of Coptic Christians, Ashkenazi Jews who had come from Eastern Europe, escaping the pogroms, the local Jewish community, and of course Muslims. And now more and more, I mean, the Jews have all left, and the Copts themselves are dwindling and being persecuted. To what extent is this novel nostalgic? Is this a nostalgia for cosmopolitan, to use a kind of problematic term, Cairo?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was really interested in this idea of a cosmopolitan Cairo because you can feel that, in the street, in the architecture. It's still an incredibly, vibrant city, but not quite as, diverse ethnically or religiously as it once was. And you can feel that, but it was less the sort of nostalgia for the past and more kind of thinking to the future in Cairo and elsewhere. In looking to that past coexistence, to use another problematic term, I wanted to sort of look to future possibilities of that in the Middle East, but also everywhere. Because that's what was most interesting to me, was this past that people don't want to remember or don't remember for whatever reason. I wrote this article for the Jewish Daily Forward, if that means anything. Anyone basically can understand what the newspaper is from the name, but about Passover and why it's important to remember. Passover is a story about Jews being in Egypt as slaves and the redemption from that. And my article was that it's important to remember this other 1,000 years of Egyptian Jewish history, because that's maybe more relevant to our own experience than this experience of slavery, which is actually historically inaccurate. And one of the sort of first comments on it was all about like how Egyptians had mistreated Jews and all these different examples and what have you. But they were all from the 20th century. and almost all of them were after 1948. And so, you know, there's this past that happens the 900 years before that I'm really interested in, you know, and that I think raises a lot of possibilities of what the future might bring, or what I would hope the future might bring.
So along those lines, will you read this really beautiful first paragraph?
Oh, yeah.
And this is one of my favorite parts of the book. And then maybe I'll ask you to read some questions.
A long, long time ago. Yeah, it really did. That's a great segue. Before Mubarak and the revolution, before Sadat and Begin, before Nasser, the free officers, and the Suez crisis, before the Suez Canal, before Herzl, before Dreyfus, before Solomon Schechter and the Cambridge University Library, before Ismail Pasha and Muhammad Ali Pasha, before the British, the French, the Ottomans, the Mamluks, the Ayyubids, before the Great Plague and Saladin, before Maimonides, the great sage, may his memory be a blessing. Our story begins before all this, in the reign of El-Mustansir, when Cairo was still 2 cities, and the Jews but a tribe among them.
How can you not keep reading like that? I mean, I think time is such an important element, not only the way that you plotted the novel, but also sort of if you think about the Geniza itself, this cache of documents that are as mundane as you can imagine. These are literally grocery lists, as we've been saying. But over time, because they're so old, and we've lost our sense of what that world was like, they accrue such value to us. Not only in the religious sense, because they have value inherently if they have the name of God on them, but in a secular sense and in a historical sense, they give us a window into this world. And the only they don't, the writing, the ink doesn't turn to gold. It's simply time that transforms them into something valuable. I think that that's also something that the novel is playing with a lot.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to say anything about that, or if you'd like to choose some other.
No, I'm interested in like what persists through the centuries, and there's a lot of things that do, but very little physical things persist. Let me think about if there's anything, if any of the passages I chose reflect on that. I mean, I can just read. I haven't read anything from Agnes and Margaret's passage, so I can just read something from that.
And then maybe I'll have you. No, I'd love you to read that, and then I'd love you to read something from Ali. So we start.
Oh yeah. I'll do Ali first.
Okay, so now we're going to be in the 11th century.
11th century. Okay, that's good. So he is like an early teens Muslim boy who kind of falls into the role of watchman. And he's, at this point, he's had his first few nights, and he's still kind of unsure what's going on and what to make of this community that he finds himself within. As the days and weeks went by, Ali grew ever more accustomed to his life in Fustat, to the world of the Jews and the inverted shape of his days. He enjoyed the contemplative solitude of his schedule, watching over the synagogue when the city was asleep, and sleeping when the sun rose. Most days he awoke just after noon to the sound of children playing in the street. After washing, he prayed, prepared himself a pot of tea, and warmed a plate of food or a bit of dinner from the night before. Then he fed the kittens and set out for his daily walk around Fustat. Cutting through the mostly Coptic neighborhood around the old Babylonian fortress, he might buy a few vegetables at the produce market or some bread at the bakery El-Zikri had recommended. On days he felt particularly flush with money, he would get supper from one of the vendors, whose pots, fragrant with the murky tang of malachia or the smell of beef stew with vegetables, crowded the entrance to the produce market. When he was finished shopping, Ali usually made his way to a narrow street occupied primarily by textile workers. Beyond the tent makers, sailors, and embroiderers, there was a small fabric shop owned by Ephraim ibn Shamaria, which, for reasons no one could recall, had become a gathering place for some of the synagogue's more notable members, a kind of informal council meeting. Ali first came upon the conclave entirely by accident, trying to find a shortcut home from the produce market, and Ephraim had insisted that he sit down for a glass of tea. In the weeks that followed, Ali discovered a more direct route home, but he often found himself stopping by the fabric shop to sit, drink a glass of strong sweet tea, and listen to the men discuss the news of the neighborhood, of Fustat, Cairo, or the larger world. From time to time, one of the men would direct a question at Ali, but for the most part, he just sat and listened. Oh yeah, the sisters, yeah. Let's see here. I'll just read their introduction. Oh no, I like this one better, sorry. That's not too long. Okay. This is maybe a few months after they've arrived in Cairo. With morning, a dusty red light spilled over the Muqattam hills and filled the floor of the valley between the citadel and the pyramids. Warming the stone of the medieval city, it lingered among the pillars of the Ibn Tulun Mosque, climbed its spiraling minaret, and spun out over a quilt of streets and stone and cotton fields to the hazy rise of the pyramids. While her other half slept, Agnes sat in the blue wing-back chair next to their northerly window, contemplating the chessboard and watching the city fill with color. She usually woke a few minutes before her sister and relished the protective quiet she felt during the early sliver of morning. It made her think always of those first few minutes alone in the world, before she became a sister, a twin, before their mother died, before her life became their life, and her thoughts their thoughts. As if in response to this sentiment, Margaret opened her eyes and lifted her head, taking in the unfamiliar angle of dawn. A thread of spittle connected the corner of her mouth to the pillow, like a fish hooked to the line of sleep. Up long? Agnes shook her head and they watched the rest of the sunrise in silence. The light was different here. How could it not be? How could this sun, under whose rays Moses, Saladin, and Ramses had walked, be the same one they knew from Cambridge? The light was of a stronger weft and stubborn, refracted as it was through sand and dust and 5,000 years of history. Perhaps this persistence of light was what disposed the Egyptians towards its absence, the gloomy shadows of the veil and the cold black humidity at the center of the pyramids. Perhaps the strength of the light was what inspired that peculiar Jewish practice, burying sacred texts or secreting them away in the attic of the synagogue. How had Dr. Schechter put it? The contents of the book go up to heaven like the soul. The past in Egypt was never too far from hand, always present, always lurking in some attic or at the bottom of a forgotten chest. The entire country was a sort of palimpsest. Beneath each skin lived another, waiting for the right reactive agent, the right traveler to uncover it. Agnes waited at the bottom of until the bottom of the sun lifted itself over the horizon. Then she broke the silence. Check. What? You're in check. Margaret craned her neck to see the chessboard. It was a close and tangled bout, as their games always were. Agnes had attacked first, but Margaret hung back, drawing her sister in with the patience of a spider. That was foolish, Nestor. How do you mean? Move my bishop to Q2. Agnes made the move, and when she did, she saw her foolishness. Last. They were both silent for a long while, examining the board as they dressed and readying themselves for the day. Let me think on it, Agnes said as they walked downstairs. You're far too eager for check. And you, Maggie, are far too eager to glow.
So just one last question maybe before I open it to the audience. But do you think that women and Jews are Orientalist in the same way as people who aren't women and Jews? Let's say the standard Orientalist. Is there a different kind of Orientalism?
don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I think it was hard to write that section because I wanted to embody their mindset.
Yeah.
You know, and I even felt that when I was reading parts of it, like, you know, and they're so judgmental and, you know, so sort of patronizing towards the Egyptians, and that has to come through. You know,
yeah.
they're clearly empathetic. They clearly have a connection to it. Yeah, so that was really difficult to write that, and to write things that I knew that I didn't really agree with, but like were part of who they were. Part of the difficulty was sort of making it clear that I, as the author, didn't necessarily connect with this point of view and these words that they were using, and how to sort of make that clear.
That's where your
academic
sort of training gets in.
Yeah. But what I was able to do, I think, was to undercut them. You know, there's a certain logic to the narrative, right? And if the world is sort of disproving the way that they see the world, then that was the way that I was kind of able to get around it. They have, you know, all these ideas about Egyptians, you know, that they're late or they're lazy, and then, you know, they're always disproven in those kind of assumptions about. But this is all just one elaborate dodge of your question.
there's no right answer.
Yeah, I don't know. I was really interested in. I was talking to a professor who's a professor of history here, and he, I think, wrote a book about Jewish Orientalists, and I was really interested in that idea. And you know, his thesis, I think, if I remember correctly, was that they were different. And that because they had this sort of connection to, at the very least, Semitic languages through their knowledge of Hebrew, it sort of created this different mindset. But for, you know, at this point, you know, we don't have boys going to yeshiva, like, you know, learning Hebrew. Maybe you do. There are some, but yeah, I don't know.
Or just having less power.
Yeah, no, there's that.
Yeah.
I
asked because you seem very interested in sort of the other, that you take, I mean, marginal characters seem very important. I mean, you're coming at this story from certainly minority view.
Yeah, no, that is a much better way of thinking of it. I think that the book in a lot of ways is about encountering the other.
Yeah.
And it's about what it means to encounter the other in yourself, in your own city, in a faraway place, and what it means to encounter the other as someone who has power and privilege in some ways, but doesn't have power and privilege in other ways. You know, like Ali has power and privilege as a Muslim, but he's super poor and he's like 11 years old. So that gets sort of undercut. And Agnes and Margaret obviously have this sort of complex web of power and privilege that they, you know, kind of use and are, yeah. So I think that is really at the core of the book is encountering the other and inside yourself and in all these different ways.
And it becomes very striking in the one scene where they meet Lord Cromer, who is sort of the real embodiment of that kind of power. It becomes how clear no one else in the book has that kind of power. And
yet they have access to it.
Yes.
You know, they're able to sort of convince him, and he sees them as kin in a way. You know, and they're able to convince him to do what he wants, whereas none of the other characters in the book would have. Yeah, no, I think that's true.
You ready to open it up?
Yeah, sure.
Any questions or comments?
You covered a lot of good territory.
Well, just get started. Julia?
Yeah, I cannot wait to read this.
It's so
fascinating. Yeah. So just from the last point, I'm curious if you used the twins at all as, I think you called them her second half or something about working with that. in terms of the other? Like what did the twins give you to play with?
Oh, I didn't think about it in terms of the other, but that's really true. I really thought a lot about their point of view. I was really interested in what it would be like. So there's a third person point of view with Ali, a first person point of view with Joseph. And I kind of consider, the twins is third person, but I consider it third person plural. Because it really sort of bounces between their minds and sort of exists in the space between their two consciousnesses and their 2 points of view. And they're different, and they have conflict, but they really are sort of, in my understanding of them, just kind of working as a single force.
Did they dream the same dream at one point?
Yeah. And they can, finish each other's sentences, and they know what the other is thinking all the time. And I was really, I was talking to my dad a long time ago and telling him about the book, and he was saying that the 2 most difficult things would be, in writing it, would be inhabiting the consciousness of a twin and understanding what it would be like in the 11th century. I don't know if those were the 2 most difficult things, but those were definitely 2 things that I thought about a lot. Like, yeah, what's it mean to be a person in the 11th century? Obviously pretty different from now, but maybe not that different. Yeah.
My question is about the initial idea that you have before writing the novel. What was the reason, or what was the kind of the incentive for you really getting to there and writing about this from that whole time of the history until today and so on? This is being you being in Cairo for some time, or you studied that, or you had access to the Geneva documents and you were just seeing it and doing some work for that?
I think it was being in Cairo and like really falling in love with the city, but feeling a bit uncomfortable about how, or unsure how I fit in as an American Jew in this city, and feeling uncomfortable, rightly or wrongly, about that, that part of my identity and my love for the city, and not being able to sort of mesh those 2 things. And then coming upon this synagogue and realizing that, those 2 aspects of my identity are not incompatible. The Jews lived in Cairo for 1,000 years and, were thriving there at many points. And so that was a real profound sort of realization or moment for me, that these 2 things could exist together without, I don't want to say without conflict, but, in some sort of harmony. And I kind of became obsessed with this community and why no one ever talked about it. And so there's this whole other long story about the Watchman, which I won't go into, but which involves meeting this woman on a plane who's from Calcutta, and her telling me about her distant relatives who were watchmen of the synagogue in Calcutta, and she was a Bengali Muslim. And so that was, because there wasn't, as far as I know, a family of watchmen who watched over this particular synagogue. Though there were Muslim families who watched over other synagogues in Calcutta and elsewhere in North Africa.
Yeah, certainly in Morocco to this day, and in Tunisia as well, it's the Muslims who are entrusted with guarding Jewish heritage and who take on this role with great sense of responsibility and so on. And there's even sort of a mystical benefit that they get from it, that they get the barakah of whatever saints, the blessings of whatever saints are buried in these cemeteries, that transfers on to them. So it's very important work that's being done, and for which they get paid, and the whole families do this. And now I was just in Essaouira on the Atlantic coast in Morocco last summer, and for the first time I saw was a woman who is the caretaker of the Jewish cemetery there, which is
Yeah, cool.
which she inherited from her father.
Oh, what? Did she not have?
I don't know if her brothers were doing something else,
No.
but this was her job, and she.
That's great. Other questions? Yeah.
I guess you talked about like the kind of the imponderability of daily life that you got in the Geniza, that how good of a trove of detail the Geniza was for writing the detail in. But what other kind of methods did you to get into these characters' heads? You talked a lot kind of like from the psychological perspective of getting into characters' heads. The Geniza offers kind of material aspects of what life looked like, but how did you go into the mentality of these characters in the past, and what was your process like for writing them?
Well, for the 11th century, I think I thought about it for a while, and I was just like, I just have to decide that being a human in the 11th century was basically the same as being a human now, and like with sort of different technology, because I don't know how I would write it otherwise. For the sisters, there's a really great biography of them called the Sisters of Cyanide, and they also wrote a number of books. And so I was able to read their own first-person accounts of a previous trip to Egypt, which is actually, which they're more well-known for, where they discovered this palimpsest that became really important for a little while. And so, yeah, getting their voices, they each wrote accounts of it, this trip. So getting their voices through that was really nice. And then, this is not getting inside people's head, but I have a old Baedeker's guidebook of Cairo, or Egypt, I think, from that time period. And so I was able to sort of fact check, because it covers a lot of the places that they would go to. So I was able to be like, oh, here's how many pounds it costs to, spend a night at this hotel, and like, here's how much a meal is, and here's what this sort of cranky British guy thought of the food here, and so that was also a really great resource. Yeah.
A question that compares the Egyptian Jewish experience as you portray it to the Spanish Jewish experience. I don't know much about the history of the Egyptian Jewish experience. I know a tiny bit more about Spain. In Hebrew school when we were little, we're taught the Jews had a golden age in the 600 or 700 years that they lived under Muslim rule in Spain. However, when you find out more about that, you realize that wasn't universally true. There were some Muslim regimes in Spain that were very hospitable to the Jews, and some that were not. And that's the very reason that Maimonides left Cordoba and ended up in Cairo. I'm wondering whether the same ebb and flow of tolerance and coexistence existed in the 1,000 years you're talking about in Egypt, and therefore whether you are over-idealizing the millennium of coexistence.
Yeah, no, there was certainly, ups and downs, as it were, and, rulers who were more tolerant of Jews and Christians, and rulers who were less tolerant of them. And I wouldn't want to sort of minimize that by any means. Yeah, but I think that I keep coming back to what Maimonides wrote when he, as the epigraph of the book, after he moved to Cairo, which is that, I'm paraphrasing, but Jews have, been traveling and wandering for hundreds of years, but we finally found a resting place in this city. And what's remarkable about that for me is not that it shows that Jews had this great time for 1,000 years and it was all hunky-dory. But what's remarkable is that the greatest Jewish philosopher of all time, probably one of the most brilliant Jews that ever lived,